What made 40 families sue our school district at the same time? Ms. Hayes handed me my college rejection letter during lunch period with this smile that didn't reach her eyes. Stanford had been my dream school since freshman year, and I'd spent 3 years building a perfect application with a 4.0 GPA, perfect SAT scores, and enough extracurriculars to fill 2 pages. The rejection email was polite but generic, thanking me for my interest while wishing me success elsewhere. What made it weird was Ms. Hayes watching my face as I read it, like she was waiting for something specific to happen. She touched my shoulder with fake sympathy and said sometimes even the best students don't make the cut, then walked away before I could respond. That same afternoon, my best friend Aaliyah got her rejection from Yale. Then Terrence got his from MIT. By the end of the week, every single Black and Latino student in our senior class had been rejected from their top choice schools, while white students with lower GPAs were posting acceptance letters all over social media. I'm Keisha, and this is the story of how one college counselor's racism destroyed 40 futures before we destroyed her career. The pattern became impossible to ignore within days of those first rejections arriving. Aaliyah had a 1,580 SAT score and had founded our school's first coding club that now had 60 members, but got rejected from 7 Ivy League schools. Terrence had published actual research in a medical journal and volunteered at the free clinic for 3 years, rejected from every pre-med program he applied to. Meanwhile, Ashley Crawford with her 3.4 GPA and 0 leadership positions got into Princeton. Dylan Foster, who'd been caught cheating twice, got accepted to Georgetown. The white students weren't necessarily bad kids or undeserving, but the disparity was so obvious that even some of them started asking questions. Ms. Hayes had been our college counselor for 15 years, and everyone trusted her completely because she had this warm, grandmotherly vibe and talked constantly about her commitment to helping all students succeed. She'd scheduled individual meetings with each of us throughout junior and senior year, asking detailed questions about our backgrounds, our family situations, our dreams. I remembered telling her everything during those sessions, how my dad worked 2 jobs to afford our house in this district, how my mom had died when I was 10, how I wanted to become a civil rights attorney. She'd nodded sympathetically and taken notes, promising to write me a recommendation letter that would showcase my resilience and determination. What we didn't know was that Ms. Hayes had been writing 2 completely different types of recommendation letters. The ones she showed us in draft form were glowing, full of specific examples and genuine praise that made us feel seen and valued. But the actual letters she submitted to universities were calculated sabotage, filled with subtle racism and coded language designed to tank our applications while maintaining plausible deniability. She'd write things like, "Keisha is remarkably articulate for her background," and "shows surprising intellectual capability given her home environment, and would benefit from remedial support services your institution provides for disadvantaged students." Every sentence was crafted to sound supportive on the surface while actually telling admissions officers that we were charity cases who didn't belong at elite schools. The genius of her method was that these letters were never explicitly racist, just subtly condescending in ways that activated every bias admissions committees already had. For white students, her letters emphasized leadership, intellectual curiosity, and future potential. For us, her letters emphasized struggle, overcoming obstacles, and needing extra help. She turned our strengths into weaknesses and our achievements into surprises, all while maintaining that sweet grandmother act. The breaking point came 3 weeks after the rejections started piling up. My dad insisted we request copies of all my application materials through the Freedom of Information Act, something his union rep had suggested after hearing about the situation. Most universities refused at first, citing privacy policies and administrative burden, but Stanford's admissions office accidentally sent the full file, including Miss Hayes' recommendation letter. I read it 17 times, each time feeling sicker. She'd described me as a student who tries very hard despite significant cultural and intellectual disadvantages, and suggested I might be more comfortable at a less rigorous institution where diversity initiatives provide appropriate support structures. The letter that was supposed to be my strongest endorsement had actually told Stanford I was an affirmative action risk who would probably fail out. Every specific example I'd shared with her about my achievements had been twisted into evidence of my limitations. My refugee tutoring program became well-intentioned but unsophisticated outreach. My debate team victories became enthusiasm that sometimes overrides strategic thinking. The devastation was complete and surgical, each sentence designed to confirm whatever racist assumptions the admissions officer might already have while giving Miss Hayes complete deniability if anyone questioned her methods. Aaliyah's older brother worked in IT at a tech company downtown and had this hobby of ethical hacking, testing security systems to find vulnerabilities. When I showed him my letter, he went completely silent for almost 5 minutes before asking if we wanted to know what else Ms. Hayes had been writing. I should have said no. I should have gone through proper channels and filed complaints and trusted the system to investigate. But 40 families had been destroyed by this woman's lies, and the system had trusted her for 15 years without noticing. So I said yes, and that decision changed everything. He explained that school email systems were notoriously insecure, often using default passwords and outdated security protocols that hadn't been updated in years. Ms. Hayes was 63 years old and probably using the same password for everything, likely something obvious and personal. Within 2 hours, he'd accessed her email account using a combination of social engineering and basic password guessing. Her password was literally Grandkids 2010 with a capital G. The emails we found in her account weren't just evidence of racism. They were a manifesto of calculated hatred that had been hiding behind her grandmother's smile for over a decade. The first email that made me physically ill was from 6 years ago, sent to another counselor at a different school district. Ms. Hayes had written, "I've perfected the art of keeping these kids in their place without anyone noticing. The key is to sound supportive while planting seeds of doubt. Admissions officers know how to read between the lines when I describe students as surprisingly capable, or overcoming significant cognitive challenges. They understand I'm really saying these kids don't belong at top institutions, but I maintain perfect deniability because technically I'm praising their effort and resilience. My success rate is flawless. In 15 years, only 3 black students from my school have gotten into Ivy League schools, and 2 of those transferred out within a year. The system works beautifully when you know how to manipulate it correctly. The email was signed with her typical friendly sign-off and a smiley face emoji. The casual cruelty was almost harder to process than the explicit racism, the way she treated destroying children's futures like a fun game she was winning. There were 47 more emails like this spanning over a decade, each one detailing her methods and celebrating her success at keeping students of color out of elite universities. She'd even created a spreadsheet tracking which students she'd successfully sabotaged and which schools had rejected them, with color-coded categories for different types of racist stereotypes she'd deployed in her letters. The worst discovery came buried in a folder labeled Research Materials that contained screenshots of conservative websites discussing how diversity initiatives were lowering academic standards. Ms. Hayes had been an active member of online forums where white parents complained about qualified white students losing opportunities to less deserving minority students, and she'd appointed herself as a secret warrior fighting back against what these forums called reverse discrimination. Her emails revealed a complete alternate identity, a grandmother by day who praised diversity at school board meetings, and a bitter racist by night who strategized with internet strangers about how to maintain white dominance in higher education without getting caught. She'd even shared specific techniques with other counselors across the country, creating a network of saboteurs who were systematically filtering students of color away from top schools while maintaining perfect professional reputations. The scope was so much bigger than just our school, just our 40 families. This was a coordinated effort spanning multiple states and hundreds of destroyed futures, all hiding behind caring educator personas and diversity statements that meant absolutely nothing. Aaliyah's brother wanted to go straight to the police with everything, but I knew that wouldn't work. We'd obtained the evidence illegally, and Ms. Hayes could claim her emails were taken out of context, or that her account had been hacked by someone trying to frame her. We needed to be smarter, more strategic. So instead of going to authorities, we went to the local NAACP chapter and requested a meeting with their legal team. The conference room was small and stuffy, and the 3 lawyers who reviewed our evidence kept exchanging looks that ranged from shock to rage to grim determination. The lead attorney, a woman named Diana Okafor, finally broke the silence by saying this was the most clear-cut case of systematic discrimination she'd seen in 20 years of civil rights work. She explained that while the hacked emails couldn't be used directly in court, they provided a roadmap for legal discovery that would force the school district to turn over legitimate copies of all recommendation letters, correspondence, and internal communications. The evidence was damning enough that once legal process started, everything would unravel. She made us promise not to share the emails publicly yet, not to post them on social media or send them to the media. We needed to be patient and let the legal strategy unfold properly, even though every day of waiting felt like letting Ms. Hayes hurt more students. The next Monday, I walked into school like nothing had changed. Ms. Hayes was in her office with the door open, helping a white sophomore named Bethany research scholarship opportunities and laughing at something the girl had said. The cognitive dissonance of watching her perform kindness while knowing what lived in her email account made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to smile and wave as I walked past. She waved back with that grandmother warmth, probably never suspecting that 40 families were about to destroy her carefully constructed life. That afternoon, Diana Okafor filed a massive civil rights lawsuit against the school district on behalf of every student of color who'd worked with Ms. Hayes in the past 5 years. The complaint was 83 pages long and detailed a pattern of systematic discrimination, requesting all recommendation letters, email correspondence, and counselor evaluations as part of discovery. The local news picked up the story within hours, running headlines about discrimination allegations at our high school. Ms. Hayes released a statement through the district expressing shock and disappointment at these baseless accusations, claiming she'd dedicated her career to helping all students succeed and would vigorously defend herself against these false charges. She looked directly into the news camera with tears in her eyes, talking about how hurtful it was to be accused of racism when she'd worked so hard to support disadvantaged students. The performance was flawless, and half the comments on social media believed her completely. The school board called an emergency meeting 3 days later, and the auditorium was packed with angry parents demanding answers. White parents mostly defended Ms. Hayes, sharing stories about how helpful she'd been with their children's applications and questioning why anyone would attack such a dedicated educator. One father stood up and suggested this was just sour grapes from students who couldn't accept that they weren't as qualified as they thought, that maybe the real problem was entitlement and playing the race card instead of taking responsibility for their own shortcomings. His daughter had gotten into Yale with Ms. Hayes' help, and he found it convenient that these accusations only emerged after rejection letters arrived. The Black and Latino parents in the room sat mostly silent during this part, but I could see hands clenching armrests and jaws tightening with barely contained rage. My dad finally stood up when the board called for final comments, and his voice was quiet, but carried through the whole auditorium when he asked why every single Black student had been rejected from top schools while white students with lower qualifications had been accepted. He wasn't accusing anyone of anything, he said. He just wanted someone to explain how that pattern made statistical sense if the counseling had been fair and unbiased. The room went completely silent. The board president promised a thorough investigation and adjourned the meeting without answering the question. What the board didn't know was that Diana Okafor's team had already subpoenaed the school's email server and was working with a forensic IT specialist to recover deleted messages and archived correspondence. Ms. Hayes had been careful over the years, regularly deleting sensitive emails and clearing her trash folder, but she hadn't understood that school IT systems maintained backup archives of everything for legal compliance purposes. Every racist email she'd ever sent still existed on a server in the district administration building, and the forensic team was systematically recovering them all. Within 2 weeks, they'd reconstructed her entire email history going back 12 years, including messages she'd thought were permanently deleted. The recovered emails were even worse than what Aaliyah's brother had initially found, containing explicit racial slurs and messages to her sister and detailed strategies for sabotaging specific students' applications shared with other counselors. One email chain discussed how to identify which students of color were most likely to complain about discrimination so she could give them extra attention and positive feedback to cover her tracks, maintaining perfect documentation of supportive meetings while still destroying their college prospects through her recommendation letters. The premeditation was chilling, the awareness that what she was doing was wrong combined with detailed planning to avoid consequences. The district's lawyers reviewed the recovered emails and immediately recommended settlement negotiations. The evidence was so overwhelming that taking this to trial would result in massive damages, possible criminal charges for Ms. Hayes, and federal investigations into the entire school district's counseling program. But the superintendent, a white man named Robert Fleming who'd been in his position for 20 years, refused to settle. He held a press conference declaring that the district stood behind Ms. Hayes and would fight these allegations vigorously, that they wouldn't bow to pressure from activists trying to weaponize accusations of racism for financial gain. He suggested this was part of a larger political agenda to undermine public education and discipline, implying that the students involved were being manipulated by outside organizations with radical objectives. The press conference was a disaster that got picked up nationally, with education policy experts and civil rights organizations condemning his statements as tone-deaf and potentially illegal retaliation against discrimination complainants. What Fleming didn't know was that Diana Okafor had been recording the press conference and would use his statements as evidence of the district's discriminatory culture and deliberate indifference to civil rights violations. He'd just made the lawsuit 10 times more expensive for the district and given the legal team ammunition for punitive damages, on top of compensatory relief. Then the dominoes really started falling. A reporter from the state newspaper filed FOIA requests for all of Ms. Hayes' recommendation letters from the past 5 years. And when the district tried to deny the request citing student privacy, the paper sued and won in court. The judge ordered immediate release of redacted versions with student names removed but demographic information included. When those letters became public, the pattern was impossible to deny even for Hayes' most fervent defenders. Every single letter for a Black or Latino student contained subtle undermining language, coded references to deficiencies, and suggestions that the student needed extra support services or would be better suited for less rigorous programs. Every letter for white students emphasized excellence, leadership potential, and future achievement without any qualifications or caveats. A data scientist analyzed all 237 letters and published a statistical breakdown showing that Hayes used words like articulate, surprisingly, despite, and struggles almost exclusively in letters for students of color, while using words like exceptional, brilliant, natural, and destined exclusively for white students. The analysis went viral, shared by education researchers and civil rights activists across the country. Our small suburban school district had become a national symbol of how racism operates in modern educational systems, hiding behind professionalism and good intentions while systematically crushing opportunities for students of color. Ms. Hayes stopped coming to school the day after the letters went public. The district placed her on paid administrative leave pending investigation, which enraged everyone because it meant she was still collecting her $80,000 salary while the students she'd sabotaged were scrambling to salvage their college futures. My dad organized a protest outside the district administration building that drew 300 people, mostly Black and Latino families holding signs demanding accountability and justice. The local news covered it extensively, interviewing parents whose children had been rejected from every school they applied to, despite stellar qualifications. One mother broke down crying on camera talking about how her daughter had worked so hard, had believed the system was fair, had trusted Ms. Hayes completely. Her daughter had been rejected from 18 schools and was now enrolled at community college. Her dreams of becoming an engineer deferred indefinitely because one racist counselor had decided she didn't deserve opportunities. The interview was played on national news that night, and suddenly our small-town problem was becoming a national conversation about how structural racism operates in education systems, even in supposedly progressive communities. The school board met again in closed session and voted to terminate Ms. Hayes for cause, which meant firing her without the severance package her contract promised. She immediately hired a high-profile defense attorney who specialized in representing educators accused of discrimination, and they held their own press conference denying all allegations. Hayes read from a prepared statement with her voice shaking, claiming she was the real victim of a coordinated campaign to destroy her reputation because she'd held students to high standards instead of lowering expectations based on race. She said she'd written honest, accurate assessments of every student's capabilities and potential, and that if some students and their families didn't like those assessments, that was their problem, not hers. Her attorney suggested this was actually reverse discrimination, that Hayes was being targeted because she'd refused to give unearned praise to students who didn't deserve it, that the real racism was expecting her to lie in recommendation letters to help unqualified minority students gain unfair advantages. The argument was so backwards it would have been laughable, except half the conservative media immediately picked it up and ran with it, turning Hayes into their latest martyr for the supposed persecution of white people who dare to tell difficult truths about differences in academic achievement. What her attorney didn't expect was that 3 other counselors from different school districts would come forward with their own stories about Hayes. She'd been part of an online group that shared strategies for limiting minority access to competitive colleges, and she'd encouraged other counselors to adopt her methods. 2 of these counselors were willing to testify that Hayes had explicitly described her goal as maintaining white dominance at elite universities by creating what she called strategic bottlenecks in the counseling pipeline. They had screenshots of forum discussions where Hayes had written things like, "If we can't stop them from applying, we can at least make sure their applications don't shine. And the key is maintaining the appearance of support while ensuring the outcome reinforces natural hierarchies. One counselor had saved these messages because she'd been planning to report Hayes to authorities, but had been afraid of retaliation. Now that Hayes was already exposed, she found the courage to add her testimony to the growing pile of evidence. The revelation that this wasn't one rogue counselor, but an organized network of saboteurs operating across multiple districts, transformed the story from local scandal to potential federal investigation. Diana Okafor filed an amended complaint expanding the lawsuit to include the 2 other school districts where cooperating counselors had worked, and federal prosecutors opened an investigation into potential civil rights violations. The Department of Education announced they would review all college counseling programs in the state for evidence of systematic discrimination, threatening to withhold federal funding from districts that couldn't prove their programs were free of bias. Our small lawsuit had triggered a statewide reckoning with how counseling programs function and how much power individual counselors have to shape or destroy student futures without oversight or accountability. Suddenly, every family was questioning whether their children's counselors were actually helping or subtly sabotaging, whether recommendation letters actually reflected their children's abilities or counselors' biases. The trust that made the educational system function had been shattered, and nobody knew how to put it back together again. The settlement negotiations finally began in late spring, too late to fix the current year's college applications, but hopefully in time to prevent future sabotage. The district's insurance company was desperate to settle before trial because their actuaries calculated potential damages in the tens of millions if a jury saw all the evidence and heard testimony from 40 families about destroyed dreams and derailed futures. Diana Okafor demanded full restitution for all affected students, including payment for reapplication costs, compensation for delayed college entry, coverage of community college tuition until students could reapply and get accepted to appropriate 4-year programs, and punitive damages substantial enough to ensure no other district would tolerate this behavior. The district's lawyers argued this would bankrupt the school system, that punishing taxpayers for one employee's misconduct was unjust, that the financial burden would harm all students, including those who'd been victims of Hayes' discrimination. Diana responded that districts had a legal obligation to supervise employees and prevent civil rights violations, that if supervision had functioned properly, Hayes would have been caught and stopped years ago, that the financial burden was entirely appropriate given the magnitude of harm caused by institutional failure. The settlement was finalized on a Friday afternoon in June. The district agreed to pay $41 million to be distributed among affected families based on documented harm, with larger payments going to students who'd been rejected from multiple schools, and smaller payments to students who'd eventually gained admission to competitive programs despite Hayes' sabotage. Every affected student would receive funding to reapply to any colleges they chose with new recommendation letters written by independent counselors selected by the plaintiff's legal team. The district also agreed to implement comprehensive anti-discrimination training for all counselors, establish an independent oversight committee to review recommendation letters for bias, and create a whistleblower protection program for students and staff who reported discrimination. Ms. Hayes herself would forfeit her pension as part of a separate settlement avoiding criminal prosecution, though she'd also been permanently banned from working in education anywhere in the state. The settlement was publicly announced the following Monday, making national news as one of the largest discrimination settlements in educational history. Some people celebrated it as justice served, others condemned it as excessive punishment that would harm students through reduced school funding and services. I wish I could say the settlement fixed everything, that the money and new policies erased the damage Hayes had caused and restored everyone's faith in the system. But compensation isn't the same as justice, and justice isn't the same as healing. I'd missed my chance to attend Stanford at 18, the age when most students begin that journey, and while I could reapply for the following year, something had been permanently taken that no amount of money could restore. The experience of having your dreams crushed by someone you trusted, of discovering that a person who smiled at you and claimed to support you was actually working to destroy your future, that kind of betrayal leaves scars that don't heal with time or settlements. Aaliyah got accepted to Yale on her second application and is thriving there now, but she told me she still has nightmares about opening rejection letters and still questions whether professors and advisors actually believe in her abilities or are just being polite. Terrence got into Johns Hopkins Medical School, but dropped out after one semester because he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong there, that Hayes had been right about him all along even though every objective measure proved otherwise. The psychological damage was deeper and more permanent than anyone had anticipated. Ms. Hayes never apologized or acknowledged what she'd done. In her final statement before disappearing from public life, she maintained that she'd done nothing wrong, and that history would vindicate her once people stopped being blinded by political correctness and identity politics. She moved to Florida to live with her daughter and occasionally posts on social media about the persecution of conservatives in education, painting herself as a victim of cancel culture who'd been destroyed for refusing to lower standards. Her supporters still defend her in comment sections, sharing her posts and praising her courage to stand against what they call the tyranny of diversity mandates. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, watching someone who systematically destroyed children's futures claim victimhood because she faced consequences for those actions. But that's how racism operates in modern America, hiding behind professionalism and merit and standards, denying its own existence even when confronted with undeniable evidence, claiming reverse discrimination when accountability finally arrives. I eventually got accepted to Stanford on my second application, and I'm finishing my sophomore year now studying political science and education policy. My focus is on how systematic discrimination operates in supposedly neutral institutional processes, how bias hides in recommendation letters and evaluation rubrics and counseling practices that seem fair on their surface. I want to understand how people like Ms. Hayes operate for years without detection, how systems fail to catch them, how we can build better oversight and accountability mechanisms. The 40 families who sued together formed a foundation that monitors college counseling programs and provides resources for students who suspect discrimination, creating the oversight that should have existed all along. We meet quarterly to share updates and strategies, maintaining the solidarity that made victory possible. Some families have moved on. Others, like mine, remain actively involved in education advocacy work. The bonds formed through shared trauma and collective action are strange and complicated, simultaneously a source of strength and a constant reminder of what was taken from us. The wider investigation into counseling discrimination revealed that 17 other counselors across the state had been part of Hayes' online network, though most had been smart enough to delete their participation before investigators found them. 5 were fired, 6 resigned before termination. The rest kept their positions but faced mandatory retraining and enhanced supervision. The network itself was shut down and reported to federal authorities, though no criminal charges were ever filed because the First Amendment protects even repugnant speech as long as it doesn't directly incite violence. The counselors who'd shared strategies for limiting minority access to colleges couldn't be prosecuted for their online discussions, only for their actual actions in sabotaging applications. Most of them landed softly, finding new positions in private schools or educational consulting firms where background checks focused on criminal records rather than civil rights violations. The system that should have prevented them from harming more students instead allowed them to continue their careers largely uninterrupted, maybe more careful about leaving evidence but probably not fundamentally changed in their beliefs or behaviors. 3 years after everything happened, I still think about the other students Hayes sabotaged before we caught her. The hundreds of kids over 15 years who got rejected from schools they deserved to attend, who never knew their counselor had betrayed them, who blamed themselves for not being good enough instead of recognizing they'd been systematically undermined. Those students never got settlements or second chances to reapply. They built lives around the opportunities available after Hayes' sabotage, attending less competitive schools or skipping college entirely, watching their potential careers redirect toward paths they never wanted. The uncounted cost of her racism extends far beyond the 40 families who sued, rippling through generations of diminished opportunity and unrealized potential. Sometimes I imagine tracking down every student she counseled and telling them the truth. But what would that accomplish except adding knowledge of betrayal to whatever pain they've already processed and moved past? Maybe some truths are more cruel than helpful. Maybe some damage can't be undone even by revealing its source. I learned that justice in America is slow, incomplete, and available mostly to those with resources and determination to fight for years without guarantee of success. We won because we had evidence, because we had pro bono legal representation from civil rights organizations, because we had parents who could take time off work to attend meetings and protests, because our story attracted media attention that created pressure for accountability. Most victims of systematic discrimination don't have those advantages, and their stories end differently, with quiet acceptance of injustice and internalized blame for systemic failures. The settlement we received was unusual, a rare case where evidence was overwhelming and institutional support for the perpetrator collapsed under public scrutiny. In most cases, the institution protects the perpetrator. Victims are isolated and discredited. Evidence is ambiguous enough for plausible deniability, and justice never arrives. We were lucky in our way. Lucky that Hayes was arrogant enough to document her racism in writing. Lucky that we found that evidence before it was destroyed. Lucky that we had advocates who knew how to weaponize that evidence legally. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.